Hi everyone, welcome back to the weekly politics show. We've had a really long break. My name is Councillor Pyramid with co-host Councillor Andrew Wood. So we're gonna we're gonna basically cover four segments. So in the first segment, we're gonna cover something that's been coming up in the elections quite a lot. A lot of people have had debates and arguments with residents. Can the council give you a community or cultural centre? So I think a lot of candidates are going around making promises that they could, if voted in, they could deliver X or Y from the council, a bunch of goodies, which includes a building. So Andrew and I are just going to do a deep dive into that. What is feasible, what isn't feasible, and how do you go about getting a community centre if there is a genuine need in the area. And then following on from that, we're going to talk about the budget, just a roundup of the budget, look at some of the growth areas, some of the contentious areas, and just a roundup of that. Then after the break, in the third section, we're going to talk about the fire safety. That's been a growth area. There was a recent meeting done by the mayor on fire safety. Andrew sneaked in, so we'll get feedback on that. And finally, in the last section, we're going to talk about the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Obviously, people have been active on social media, and there's been a lot of fake news as well. So Andrew and I are going to go a deep dive into that, brief discussion on the conflict, and then deep dive into how both sides in the conflict are communicating their message and how they're doing it, and the possible pitfalls as well as residents of Tower Hamlets, doing a deep dive into that conflict. So we're going to go straight to break. After the break, we're going to go straight into the section, can the council give you a community stroke cultural centre? Hi everyone, welcome back to the weekly politics show. I'm Councillor Premier with co-host Councillor Andrew Wood. So we've had a fairly long break. So we're back after the break. A lot of things have happened, so we're trying to do a catch up. So first section is, can the council give you a cultural stroke community centre? So it's a question, Andrew, that I've been sort of like debating with residents. So various residents have come up to me from various parts of Tower Hamlets saying that candidates who are people who are running for election have been saying, vote for me and I'll deliver a building to your group, so to speak. And I've explained to people, look, this is government land. It's not private land. It's not, say, housing association, which is a private entity that might be able to do some kind of, but again, they're basically regulated. This is council land, and we got a lot of rules and regulations as to how we use our assets and how we dispose of them. So, Andrew, over to you. Can Tower Hamlets Council give you a community centre? So, if I'm a candidate, I go around to a group of residents who need a community centre, and I say, vote for me, and I'll guarantee that I'll get you the keys to a building. Is that a feasible thing that could happen, Andrew? Over to you.
So yes, it is possible that if a politician makes that offer to you, that they might not be completely lying to you. However, having said that, it's not an easy process. So perhaps if I talk about Mellish Street, because that's probably the best example, it's in my own ward, and that will give you an example about how, yes, you could get a brand new community centre, because the council have just spent £3 million building a 3-storey community centre for a group who are now using it for their own purposes. And it's a lovely building. So how do they get it, and how could the council do it for other people? Well, in this particular case, is that group were already renting from Tower Hamlets Council an existing building. So in their case, it was a porter cabin. And what happened was the council decided they wanted to knock the Portakabins down and actually build some housing. And as part of that housing, they would then build this separate dedicated community centre at the, well, actually not at the same time, they built that first. So then people would move out of the Portakabins into this brand new community centre, and then the Portakabins would be knocked down, and then the new residential would be built. So that has definitely happened. But this could only really happen as part of the future housing programme. So what the council might do is they might build their own community centre. So Rains Hall in Wapping was an existing building, and they basically converted that into a community centre. But they themselves are running it, or they'll look for an external partner to run it. And there are 4 of those. So what we're talking about is where an organisation is already renting some kind of facility from Tower Hamlets Council. And if that area is then redeveloped as part of the housing programme, then yes, you almost certainly will get a brand new community centre out of it. But if you're a group that does not already have a community centre, then I don't see how it would work, unless, again, as I said, there was a new housing development which the council were leading on, and then maybe as part of that they would build a new community centre, and then maybe they would then sort of allow a group to then use that. I know, for example, very close to where I live at Island Point and Westfray Road, Poplar Harker built a new community centre as part of that, and there is a lot of competition for that space, but Poplar Harker want to retain control of it. They don't appear to want to lease it to somebody else, because it would then be up to that group to then run it. So yes, a politician could make you that offer, but unless you knew for definite that either you already had a building or the council, you could rent a building from the council, I don't see it happening. I've been looking at the capital programme. There is already a fixed programme for the next 2 or 3 years. So unless, there's for definite a housing programme underway in your area, realistically, there's not going to be any new community centre built separately on its own for years from now.
And can you go through that capital programme? What community centres are highlighted, or what areas? So at least people could go deep dive. If you live in the area, you could go have a look.
So I was actually just looking for it just now, and it's buried in. This is part of the problem, even for councillors who know what they're looking for. It's actually quite difficult to find some of this stuff. So I'm actually looking for one of my complaints has been is actually very little detail about the housing programme. But having said that, there is a consultation website that the council run called, I think it's called Let's Talk. So if you look at that, there's all of the historic consultations underway for different developments. So if your estate is not on that website, almost certainly that means that it's not in any of the current programmes. Because, the council does have this big programme of capital investment. I don't think it's going that well. It's proving very expensive, but it is also taking a very long time. So there are things that were talked about, that were given planning permission like 3 years ago, where work has only recently started. So realistically, these things, I found it now. I found it. Okay. So in terms of this list, community centres. So there's Strahan Community Centre. That will cost £700,000. Mellis Street, as I said, £3 million. St Paul's Way Community Centre will be £1.6 million. Waterloo Gardens Community Provision, £1.1 million. Gill Street Community Provision, £700,000. And I think that's it. So that's the current programme of where new community centres are being built as part of the housing programme. And that's actually a document, I think, from June, the 30th of June, 2021 Cabinet Papers. And the list.
And if there is competition, say there's different groups competing for the same space, how does the council go about adjudicating, so to speak? Is there a set process, or is it a whisper in the right ear, so to speak?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure I know the answer to it. In theory, this should be a commercial type process. In practice, I'm not sure it is, because, for example, the council will be advertising empty units. If you want to rent a shop, there's a part of the website that actually is a bit out of date. But yeah, there's in theory somebody you can contact about renting, whereas this seems to be a kind of more ad hoc process that people sort of say, oh, there's a building there, can I have that please? So I suspect it will be first come, first served. But as I said, you need to find a space that you could rent from the council to get your foot in the door. The other way, as I said, is if there is a estate regeneration, maybe a good example is then as part of that consultation process, make sure that there's a community centre built into it, which there should be anyway. And then when it is actually get built, then obviously you start bidding to be the people that then run that community centre.
So I just want to come back to, so one of the other things is what I've heard is people giving the buildings for free. And I said to them, look, we're a council, it's a public body. It has to be value for money. It has to be a commercial transaction, so to speak. And we get audited, and we have to justify the valuations in the sales of the assets. Sometimes the council gets an external estate agent to do the transaction, or sometimes it's done by the property team. But again, the valuations have to stack up, so to speak. Is that correct? They have to be commercial transactions.
So yes and no. So you won't get it for free is a simple answer. So in most cases, what people are doing is renting facilities. They're not buying them outright. It'd be quite difficult to buy them outright, and that's generally what the council is not doing. So in most cases, people are renting, and they will pay a rent. But how that process is controlled, I don't think is particularly value for money. There's only one example I've really got where I did get some detailed information about a sort of council-owned asset where I think actually they were looking to sell it. And I am convinced that the price the council were talking about was not a commercial price based on the value of that site and how close it was to Canary Wharf. So I think in reality is that there will be a discount, either rent or purchase, but the council can't give it away for free. And they have to be careful about having too low a price. They still have to justify the price that they are charging. And in terms of the audit process with the financial auditors, they have got into trouble with their one of the reasons why the financial accounts haven't been signed off is actually some of the valuations that they came up with, well, in this case, particularly schools, the auditors did not agree with. So I think that will be more of a focus in the future than there has been in the past, the valuations of properties.
So I think there's a lot of I think things happen in the past. I know the previous mayor, some of their decisions were overturned. I know one particular case in my ward, the decision was overturned by external auditors. And when this Labour administration got in, they standardized it. Councillor David Edgar, who's my colleague in Myland, he did a bit of work called community rent, where they standardized the rent, so there isn't a discrepancy. And when they were renewing the leases with groups on council assets, they made sure everyone's on that community rent. So there seems to be a push towards standardizing. So I would presume that community rent would be a baseline for any point. That's my understanding of that.
No, I think the interesting thing would be is that, for example, talking about Mellor Street again, there were these old porta cabins that had been used by the NHS before. They weren't, particularly nice or fantastic. So yes, the people that were renting them, wouldn't have been paying a lot of money because they weren't worth a lot of money. But what they are now renting is a really nice £3 million property. It's only been happening for the last couple of months. So what I'm not clear about is what will now happen to their rent now that they are now occupying a bigger and more purpose-built facility. Arguably, the rent should go up because we spent and the other problem with this Mellor Street is not only do we spend £3 million of housing money on this, but also there's less space for affordable housing. So my gut estimate is we probably lost about 15 affordable homes by building this community centre separately. So there's not just the rental issue, that's also the fact that we are foregoing either building new affordable homes or perhaps building space that might be rented on a more commercial basis in a community centre.
Cool. So we're coming to the end of this section. So if anybody has any other questions coming up in the election, just message me or Andrew, and we're happy to do a section on that. If anybody's candidates promising things, we'd like to know what they're promising, and see if they can be delivered.
I will offer you more, by the way. So whatever you've had, I will offer you more.
So that's Andrew's pitch. Yeah. So we're going to go straight into the break, and after the break, we're going to do a roundup of the budget. So the budget was passed last Wednesday. There was a bit of drama. I've been told I wasn't there. But we're going to go do a roundup of the budget and talk about some of the issues. So we're going to go straight into a break now. Hi everyone, welcome back to the Weekly Politics Show. I'm Councillor Premier with co-host Councillor Andrew Wood. So in this section, we're going to talk about the budget. So last Wednesday is the final budget of Mayor John Biggs for this term. We don't know what the result of the election is going to be, but this is his final budget for this term. So I presume he'd want to leave a stamp, so to speak, of a summary of what his 4-year term was and what we can look forward to if he's re-elected after the elections. Andrew, I wasn't there. I was actually abroad. But what are the highlights? What are the takeaways from the budget? So I did speak to residents who watched the budget. So interestingly enough, quite a lot of people watched the budget, and it was kind of like State of the Union speech. Mm-hmm. That's what they were saying, that it reminded them of the American presidents, so like a State of the Union, giving a vision of the person, what they want to do, and more about him rather than the council. Was that a correct summary, Andrew? A presidential budget, so to speak.
So to be completely honest, I actually walked out in the middle of that speech because I just heard some words that I just didn't agree with, and I just thought I'd be better off doing some work back in the office. So yes, I think it probably was presidential, and I was already annoyed by comments that somebody else had sort of made before, and I wasn't particularly happy with what happened in the process anyway. And then the whole debate before that wasn't really about the issues, with one or two exceptions. I think what residents heard was probably more. Yeah, so they heard more than I did. So I'll probably have to go back and listen to it.
And then from social media afterwards, it appears one of the Labour councillors voted against the budget. She did sort of like put out a tweet with a statement. One of the things she was upset about was she wasn't allowed to speak. So my understanding is that every councillor is allowed to speak on the budget. There isn't actually a time limit on the budget meeting. Is everybody gets to speak. Mm-hmm. That's my understanding. Everybody gets their 3 minutes.
Yeah.
And the way the budget works is it's more or less a single meeting about a single motion. So the mayor, probably seconded by his head of finance, put a motion saying this is how much we're going to tax, and the budget envelope, so to speak, which is this is how much we're going to raise council tax by, and then this is how much money we anticipate, and this is how we're going to spend it. And then any councillor, in theory, or any two councillors in theory, could put an amendment, changes to that. So normally what happens is the opposition councillors put in amendment. they get debated, and then a vote happens on the various amendments, and then a final vote on the budget. But in that process, everybody should be able to speak. So I was quite surprised by that complaint by Councillor Salva. Any other highlights? Any other takeaways from that, Andrew?
Yeah. So the other thing that happened. So myself and Councillor Peter Golds, we did submit an alternative budget motion. It was a bit short. It wasn't very detailed because the day I was meant to write it and do all of the detailed work was the day that Putin invaded Ukraine. So I was rather distracted from that point onwards. But we did submit one. And then Councillor Peter Golds got COVID, so he couldn't come to the meeting. And then basically we weren't allowed to raise our opposition motion because it said, it needs 2 people in the chamber. And it said that's because of the government rules. And actually it's not that you need 2 people in the chamber. So the rules about having 2 councillors to back a motion is not government rules. And actually a year ago we did find, actually on behalf of Councillor Rubina Khan, ironically, evidence as to, she on her own should be able to raise a motion. But again, the council said no. So our alternative budget motion, I spoke about it briefly, but we weren't allowed to present it. And when I did speak, I was heckled. So I probably wasn't in a bad mood anyway. I was in a bad mood anyway that night. So
my understanding was they changed the rules. So we were like, any single councillor can raise but that means the rules were changed again.
Well, no. So I think that the council kind of forgot about that actually. So a year ago, because the problem was that Councillor Rubina Khan, as a single councillor, didn't have a group of 2. So what we found was evidence that actually says it would be undemocratic for her not to be able to raise a motion just because there's only one of her. But what always happened in meetings is I've always backed her up. I've always, supported her motions. She wasn't there on that night, by the way, to repay the favour. But the council forgot that we told them a year ago, no, that what the regulations actually say, or the rules actually say, is a single councillor is allowed to raise a motion. If I had not been in the chamber, if I'd been at home like Peter, then yes, that would have been, right. I couldn't have done it. But they were sort of saying, no, you need 2. But that's a council rule, not a government rule.
Well, interesting enough, that's been challenged in the High Court about the council making its own rules. So one of the issues, the main arguments by the, say, Brick Lane campaign, which has been accepted by the High Court, was that the council just can't make up rules willy-nilly. And this was in regards to planning, that they have to be reasonable and within the rules of natural justice. And the council were arguing, no, it's our rules, we do whatever we want. And the High Court judge goes, no, we're going to look at it and hold it up to the test. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what the outcome of that judgment is, because then that will basically force the council to review everything, that they can't just make things up. It has to be reasonable or standard practice, so to speak. So it's again. So were you ruled? Was it ruled out in the council chamber, or were you told beforehand that you can't even submit it?
So we were told beforehand, I think. But the reason I didn't make a huge amount of fuss on the night is also because this is the perfect argument why you need to elect more opposition councillors. The fact that because the other opposition groups didn't raise opposition motion, so the only opposition motion was the one that I wrote with Councillor Peter Golds. And by the way, one of the things that we introduced, so the council are proposing a 1% council tax increase and fees and charges increase of about 5.4%. And within that 5.4% increase in fees and charges, like parking goes up by 5%, but the charges to street traders goes up by 11%. And one of the very last minute changes we made with our budget motion is because of the Ukraine crisis, is actually we decided is that we would zero out, so there would be no increase in the fees and charges, and there would also be no council tax increase. We also kind of wrote within there that if the mayor wanted to come back and kind of reallocate that council tax saving saving for lower income households, we would be okay with that. Because we're deeply worried about the inflationary impact of Ukraine and all the stuff that was already happening before that anyway. But what it meant is that this opportunity to debate about no increases on our residents didn't get properly debated because of this council imposed rule of having two rather than one people in the room.
Well, these are valid points because the cost of living is going up. I saw a projection that inflation is going to be 7%.
Yeah.
So that's the highest. That's the highest since I was since I was an adult. I think when we were growing, well, my father was telling me like when in the 70s it was really high, but then that era of high inflation went down, and we've had low inflation, low interest rates. Now with inflation going up, I could see. And pay isn't going up, so we'll have to pay through that. I've noticed my price of coffee has gone up by 30p in the last few days. Someone noticed the Tesco meal deals have gone up. We had a debate at work. Everybody in the office was talking about the Tesco meal deals going up. So it's the price of everything's going to go up. So I think these are valid issues about we made decisions on an assumption, and now those assumptions are no longer there, and it will have an impact. We won't see the impact before this election, but after the election, I could see us going into a recession and the council dealing with the consequences of that.
Well, I mean, the energy price cap changes on the 1st of April, and that's going to be a huge shock. So especially if April is a cold month, people's heating bills are just going to skyrocket, and they're going to go up again later in the year because of the Ukraine crisis, and then people's food bills are going to go up because of all of the food that's grown in Ukraine and Russia, and the farmers aren't planting right now in Ukraine. They're turning away Russian military kit. So yes, I mean the impact of Ukraine, and I think that was what disappointed me about that night is yes, okay, fine, vote against our budget amendment. I don't have any issues with that. But, this crisis does bring, is going to have a material financial impact on the council, on our residents. And there was no debate about that at all, except for, when I spoke and raised those issues. It was kind of all very self-congratulatory. And then, and reading what Councillor Gabriella Salva-McCallan wrote, it's something that we've been talking about in Overview and Scrutiny for a couple of years now, that the council is always making budgets based on bad information or out of date information, and we cut more than we need to cut because we're always underestimating the amount of money we're going to have in future years. That may not be the case in the next year because of this financial crisis. I don't know, but that's part of the problem with this budget process. It's a kind of very slow moving process and can't be changed at the last. Well, it can be changed at the last minute. It's not impossible to make those changes because our budget amendments were signed off by the finance team, but it's not something that the council themselves like to do.
Well, there were growth areas to that, so it's not just cuts. One of them's fire safety. Were there any other growth areas? I know there's a debate about youth services. The council. I was in a meeting in Mile End where residents and the mayor got into an altercation where the residents declared that youth services being cut, and the mayor saying no, it isn't. And it was kind of weird being in the middle, just watching this ping pong battle.
Yeah. So in terms of, if you do year-on-year comparisons, it's being cut. I mean, they've been slow to recruit staff, so it's entirely true that staff numbers may go up a little bit, but if you compare that to, let's say, 2 years ago, it is being cut. And I think that's part of the problem. And again, this is what Overview and Scrutiny have been saying for a couple of years, is that we didn't need to cut youth services as much as, or other services as much as we have done in recent years, because actually, especially this year, the government, gave us a lot more money than we were expecting. So one of the things is, I think the original plan was to increase council tax by 2.5%. And you could see this within the numbers, because actually they got one of the numbers wrong, or they didn't change a number when they changed it down to 1%. And I think they then realised, oh, the government had given us way more money than we were expecting. We got more business rates money than we were expecting. So I think quite late in the day, they cut the council tax increase from 2.5% down to 1%. And they're also going to end this year with, £8.3 million of extra COVID money that they haven't spent yet. So if you look at a wide range of areas, they do have more money than they were expecting, by 30 or 40 million pounds approximately.
So we're going to go straight into the break. After the break, we're going to do a deep dive into one of these growth areas, which is fire safety. So the council pledged to spend more money on fire safety. Andrew and I are going to do a deep dive into that, and then do a deep dive into a meeting that Andrew sneaked into. And we're gonna have more details about that meeting from Andrew. So we're gonna go straight into break. Hi everyone, welcome back to the weekly politics show. I'm Councillor Premier with co-host Councillor Andrew Wood. So in this section, we're going to talk about fire safety in the borough. It's quite topical because of Grenfell and because of recent events has happened. There's been a recent fire in again another tall building in Aldgate. In the Spitalfields ward, I did speak to the local councillor about it. Him and the local MP Rushnara Ali went there Tuesday just to speak to residents, see if everything's okay. So it is something that is on the back of the mind of residents, given Grenfell and recent fires in Tower Hamlets. Tower Hamlets has one of the largest concentrations of tall buildings in all London boroughs. I guess people are talking about it on the doorstep, and the mayor and the Labour administration are increasing funding towards fire safety. Andrew, you've had a deep dive into this. Does it address the issues that you've been raising for a long time, especially in terms of tall buildings, the lack of tall towers or water pressure, etc.?
No, so I'll talk about the budget, and then I'll talk about the meeting that I went to, or an online meeting that I joined in my own name, by the way. So I didn't sneak in. I didn't try and pretend to be John Smith or anything like that. I went under the Andrew Wood name. So the first part of it is that, yes, there is an increase in the budget, quite a big increase for a fire safety team, funding for cladding and remediation. So they used to have 2.5 people working at the council who were paid for by the government. And what these people were doing is basically writing to building owners and collecting information about building safety, and then entering that information onto a database held, or supplying that information to the Department of Local Government and Housing. I can't pronounce Dulwich, name of it. But what basically happened is that that team were behind in their work. They were using Microsoft Excel to keep a track of everything. And there was an internal audit report that basically said, there's lots of problems with data and they're behind and all the rest of it. And the government were asking them to collect more information about lower buildings, because what they originally were collecting information about was just purely tall buildings with ACM cladding. So they're basically growing the team from 2.5 people to 8 people. But again, what this team will be only used for is gathering this information from all of the different buildings, high and medium rise, to supply to government. And what I think was misleading about what was said a few days ago is I have asked for the information as a councillor that the council are collecting. They won't give it to me. They won't share any of the information they've collected with me as a councillor. I'm not the only councillor that they've refused access to that information. I know another Labour councillor has asked for access to that information. They've been refused. I've asked the department via an FOI. I've been refused that way as well. So you basically will have a big team of people collating lots of information about the building safety of lots of buildings, and they'll be sharing it with central government. But as it stands, there is no commitment to share that information with anybody else. And what I've been talking about and other people have been talking about, and actually this happened in the Mayor of London's budget. In the Mayor of London budget, some of the opposition parties suggested that the Mayor of London set up a kind of fire safety hub to kind of provide help and advice to residents. Because what you've currently got are residents becoming their own experts and, you know, talking to each other and sharing information with each other, but they don't have anybody else to kind of help them, you know, gather information or answer their questions. So the opposition parties thought that would be a good idea. The Mayor of London did not agree with that, so he removed that budget amendment. So as it stands, this big team of 8 people, I don't think will have any direct benefit to residents. I mean, yes, it'll improve the fire safety picture. Yes, government will have information. This is a good thing, but I don't think it will necessarily directly help residents in the way that that has been presented, unless the culture of that team changes. And what we had in the amendment that I presented was basically this idea of having a bigger team of people, maybe adding 2 or 3 extra people whose job it would be to go talk to residents and kind of feedback, you know, and answer their questions. So that's the first part of it. And then the second part of it was this very interesting meeting that the mayor held a few nights ago. And I think what was most interesting about it wasn't so much what the politicians said, is actually what was good about it is actually residents affected by the Aldgate fire had an opportunity to speak. And I recognized somebody from their Twitter profile who I knew lived in. In fact, there were 2 residents in that building who spoke on Thursday night. And again, you know, lots of really good ideas about what they should do. And the mayor sort of said he'd take it away and look at it. But these are issues that we've known for years. So one of the classic ones being housing associations looking after these properties don't have full control of these buildings. They don't really know what's going on. In this particular case, it was Network Homes. And I know Network Homes from another building where there are fire safety issues. They're not really on top of these issues because they don't control the whole building, and they're part of the problem as well. So I found it very interesting. It was good to hear from residents, but I didn't really hear any solutions. And there's a bit of crackle on the echo, and not echo on the line, but there's a static in the line, Purud, and if you're hearing that. Okay,
I'm not hearing it. Are you hearing it now? Is that better now?
Yeah. So so that was interesting. That it was a hearing exercise rather than the mayor saying, "This is what I'm going to do." So the issue of the 64-meter ladder was really interesting. So at that Aldgate fire, actually both 64-meter tall ladders, which are currently operational in London, both came to that fire, and one of them was definitely fighting the fire by spraying water from the outside. And one of the big complaints in Tower Hamlets has been is that none of those tall ladders, including the 64-meter ladders, are actually physically located here in Tower Hamlets, in the place with the most tall buildings. So even though we had a motion about this last year, it doesn't sound like anybody's actually gone to talk to London Fire Brigade about how we as the council could help them financially with either getting a new tall ladder or with other equipment that they might need.
Well, that meeting was run by the Labour Party. A lot of members were kind of confused. Someone posted it on social media, on one of the Labour Party WhatsApp groups. A lot of people didn't understand what the meeting was about. It said Labour, then it's £1.2 million fire safety education or training. It was called training. I think the word training was used in the publicity. So I guess it is an election issue, but is that how we address it?
Well, so yeah, it was odd. It was actually called a rally, so I couldn't quite figure out what that meant.
I've got something else. You've probably got, there's probably different versions of it. Let me get my version out. Sorry. This is really interesting. So you got rally.
Yeah, so I thought that, so they definitely talked well, definitely one of the things I saw used the word rally. What it wasn't was a kind of a talk through of what's in the manifesto, what's proposed in the manifesto to see what people think about it. It was kind of like meetings that we've already had, which is like we hear about people's problems with fire safety, which a lot of the stuff we've heard before. What was new, obviously, was the Aldgate fire and having people in the building talking about what happened in Aldgate, which again, I think will add new lessons. So one of the lessons for me about the Aldgate fire, I don't know if you saw some of the videos, is actually the glass panels blew out and literally traveled across the road. And one of my concerns is that some of these new buildings, they're talking about building them, really close to each other, like 12 meters apart, up to like 40 stories in height. And the risk being is that if you had a fire in one building, could it spread to the other building? And looking at the pictures from Aldgate, the answer is yes, because in Aldgate you had glass and debris blowing, more than 12 meters across a road, actually across 3 lanes of traffic. So,
but the question is, do we need tall buildings? Because I was one of the interesting things was I was in Muscat, where they just banned skyscrapers. So there are no skyscrapers, and I had a debate with an architect who said, "Oh, it's really frustrating. We can't build tall buildings." But you don't really need tall buildings. You go to Paris. If you look at Paris, they got a restriction on heights as well. So do we need tall buildings, Andrew? Other European cities and other cities in the world have a height restriction. Why is it in Tower Hamlets we're just allowing things to reach for the sky and create more problems?
So the answer is that we need tall buildings to deliver our housing targets, but that is only true as long as we focus the majority of development into relatively small parts of Tower Hamlets. So if you're only going to allow major development in the Aldgate, Isle of Dogs, Poplar areas, plus 1 or 2 little bits elsewhere, the only way you can deliver the quantity of housing that's required is by going very high. If you were to spread out development more across Tower Hamlets, then you wouldn't need to go so high. So it's very interesting. There's a really good map at the council, which I'm going to try and use a lot over the coming weeks, that shows in the 1960s, when they built the tower blocks, this first generation tower blocks after the war, is they're all over Tower Hamlets. You look across Tower Hamlets, so the blocks built in the 60s and 70s, they're equally spread across the whole of Tower Hamlets. They're all over the place. When you look at the tall buildings built today, they're almost exclusively in a handful of areas. They're in the Aldgate area by the City of London. They're in the E14 postcode area and little few bits and pieces by Whitechapel. That's it. And outside of those areas, it's actually quite low. And yeah, so that's really the choice that we've made, is we've chosen to focus development in a relatively small area, and therefore it has to go high.
Yeah. Well, where do you see this sort of like coming as an election issue? Would this become a major election issue? Are you hearing it on the doorstep? So especially in Canary Wharf, where you got a lot of these tall buildings.
So I think so we have some very motivated people who live in affected buildings who are owners, very focused on this issue because it's going to have is having a huge impact on their lives. I'm not sure they're that in terms of what was seen so far from Labour and John Biggs. Certainly, I feel it's not particularly. Yeah, it wouldn't sort of attract me. I haven't heard anything from Lutfur Rahman about this issue, but I think that's an opportunity for him actually to get votes out of areas that he normally doesn't get votes from. I'll be talking about what I think needs to happen in terms of fire safety, because there's lots of things the council could be doing to help in this area by taking more of a leadership role. But it's still, again, at this rally, it's government's fault. It's government's fault rather than, yes, the majority of this is government's fault. But what are we doing to change government's mind on some of this stuff other than, meetings with ministers? Where are we gathering the evidence to change how this all works? So what are we doing to help the London Fire Brigade with some of these issues? And my concern remains is that, we'll have another really bad fire and we'll learn a whole bunch of new lessons. So.
Cool. So we're going to come up to a break. It's another issue to watch out for. Things can change. between now and the election, and something to watch out for. So we're going to go straight to break. Straight after the break, we're going to talk about Ukraine-Russia conflict, and especially the communications or fake news that's out there, and we'll tackle that straight after the break. Hi everyone, welcome back to Weekly Politics Show. I'm Councillor Premier with co-host Councillor Andrew Wood. So in this section, we're going to talk about Ukraine-Russia conflict. So I was abroad when Vladimir Putin decided to invade. I didn't think he was going to invade. I thought he was just trying to get some concessions, etc. I thought it was a bit of saber rattling, and then he invaded. So it was kind of interesting watching it all from abroad. So over there, people are quite chilled. I did discuss it in the coffee shops over there. They were more sort of like interested in the price of oil. The price of oil is going up. So that has an impact over there because most of 50% of the government revenue, for example, in Oman, comes from their oil exports. So they're more interested in that. Also a price of commodities. They import a lot of their food. So that's what the newspapers, but people weren't so agitated over there about it. Whereas here, looking into social media in the UK, it's obvious that people are taking sides in the social media. Majority of people taking support of Ukraine, along with the media. So I think people being egged on by the media. So it's kind of interesting just seeing that it seems like we're in a wartime footing. It seems like we're in a wartime footing with the media, the government, etc. Seeing Russia as a security threat, and then it seemed that, Andrew, from your experience, there seems to be some Russian interference in some of the WhatsApp groups that you were involved in. So we are in a wartime situation with the Russians. Sort of like, do you want to go through that experience and your conversation?
So I think I wouldn't say war, but it's almost like the Cold War repeating itself. It's sort of a child of the Cold War, when you had NATO versus the Soviet Union, and I think some of that will repeat. So, for example, defense spending, which has been cut and cut and cut for 30 years now, that's going to go back up again. Almost, depending on what happens in Ukraine, it may be that the Russians are so badly affected by what happens that maybe we don't need to increase defense spending. But I think we probably will need to increase it because the British Army's capability to fight, a conventional war in Europe it's crap. And it's, because actually, funny enough, the National Audit Office released a report today about the Ajax program, which is a new fleet of armored vehicles. And it's just a litany of failures, of procurement failures. So we're going to have to get more serious about that. I think the other interesting thing is, yes, the propaganda sort of battle, which Ukrainians have definitely been winning, in part because their president, actually, it turns out actually having an actor as your president is actually quite a good idea when you're trying to sort of fight a propaganda war. But the reality is that, and we've had some very serious conflicts in Europe and other parts of the world in the past, but this is repeating kind of what happened in 1939. This is one country trying to occupy another country with the intention of either permanent occupation or permanently changing its politics. And that is, yes, obviously you've got Iraq and Afghanistan, but in both of those cases, it was always very clear that we would leave at some point. It wouldn't be permanent in the same way that this would be permanent. And also some of the tactics the Russians are using. If you look back at the Battle of Grozny in, I think, 1994, when the Russians took back Chechnya, to see how bad city fighting can be. We're seeing that already in places like Mariupol as well. But in terms of like the social media side, trying to spot whether there are Russian trolls in social media groups is a very interesting process. It looks like I might have got one wrong, by the way. There's one person who I thought was overseas, actually is in the UK. But what was very interesting is I've now 3 times seen the same video presented as being from Ukraine. So it's basically a video of people lying in body bags on the ground, like rows of dead people, and then one person obviously moving because they can't breathe. And people sort of saying, well, that's from Ukraine, and it's Ukrainians, pretending that their people are dead. But it's a bit crazy. And the reason why I actually don't think that was Russian is actually you could actually read in German the titles over the top that have said Wien Protest gegen Klimapolitik, which basically means Vienna, Austria, a protest against climate change, and people lying on the ground pretending to be dead because that's what climate change will do to us, is now being presented as being from Ukraine, which I thought was a bit crazy. But no, there are definitely people in the UK who kind of either take Putin's side or who are so anti-West that, one person I know, all he talks about is there's one part of the Ukrainian army called the Azov Battalion, who are a far-right group. There's no denying it. But that's all he focuses on, nothing else. He doesn't look at the rest of kind of the Ukrainian army and all the rest of it. And I have Ukrainian friends. One of my Ukrainian friends, or actually not a friend, but somebody who I know reasonably well, she's 4 months pregnant. She's got 2 kids. She's out of Ukraine now. She's actually in Europe somewhere, and I also got friends in Russia as well who are stuck trying to figure out what to do now. And the reality is that this is morally a very simple war in some respects. Putin is bad, and Ukraine is not a perfect country and haven't done everything perfectly. I'm not saying that they are a perfect country, but countries deserve the right to make their own democratic decisions, and Putin doesn't believe in that. And it's very clear. I was able to read some of his statements before his website got hacked. He is basically trying to recreate, a form of the Russian Empire again. And we haven't had somebody like that in Europe. I mean, you can talk about Yugoslavia. I mean, there are definitely similarities there as well. But we basically haven't had somebody acting like that in Europe since Adolf Hitler in 1939.
I think the comparison with the 1930s is kind of interesting because it does seem to be there's a battle of ideas here. So you have liberal democracy, which has had a long history, say in France and the UK, and generally now the norm in Western Europe or Europe, Eastern Europe as well now. And then you have what there's a gentleman called Alexander Dugin, and I came across him there was a university friend of mine who's a Chechen. He basically told me you need to read Dugin. Everyone in Russia's reading Dugin, and the idea is kind of like liberalism is bad. Society is crumbling. We need to go back to old values. It's very it's very 1930s. It's influenced by fascist, so proto-fascist writers like Evola. There's an Italian guy called Evola. There's another interesting guy. I came across his students. René Guénon, a French gentleman. He influenced a lot of them. Just criticizing modernity, and it's just a reaction to modern society and political change. A lot of people felt in Europe that this was going too fast, and they tried to find traditional roots. Some of them found it in European culture. Some went outside into other cultures like Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam as well. So that's how I came across René Guénon. And I came across René Guénon again when Steve Bannon spoke about René Guénon and how he was inspired by René Guénon's writings. So it's part of that. And so I thought that stuff sort of like went away after the 60s, the counterculture. And now it's come back with a full force, and you've got the Russian military and establishment reading Dugin, who's based on that, and then a lot of far right groups as well in America and Europe reading that, and that's why I think Putin is supported by certain sections in Europe where you wouldn't think they would be supporting him, but they are, and I think that's a more that's the battle that we need to address, and it's not being addressed. This battle of ideas, and what my fear is that it's another Afghanistan in the 1980s. You've got all these guys going in there with a gun, or with angry man with a gun going in there and getting radicalized. So you have a lot of sort of like proto-nationalist guys going in there. They're going to get radicalized, just a bit like what happened in Afghanistan. They're going to go back to their own societies again, and it's going to have problems. So alarm bells ring when Brits are volunteering, or people from all over Europe. Or I've heard there's people from Syria going there. You got the Chechens who are anti-Russian going there. It's a recipe for disaster. And so that's my fear, is that this kind of information, we're being sucked in, but no one's kind of like addressing the ideas, and there's going to be blowback, Andrew, and I don't think anyone's thinking about that.
No, because I mean, in terms of the 1930s, what you basically had is that people deemed like the fascists were very strong, or the communists are very, the future was either fascist or communist. So you had groups in Britain that either joined the communists or the fascists, and France was the same. When France was being invaded, you had French communists helping the Nazis in effect. So you had these really, because nobody at that, nobody, that's not true, but
not French communists helping the Nazis. Yeah. No, they were fighting the Nazis.
So British people kind of lost, some, small groups within British society lost confidence in democratic Britain being actually the winner, and actually democratic Britain did win in the end over both of those alternatives. So that's what I kind of fear again, is that people will support either side, or because they hate their own country so much that they will repeat some of this kind of propaganda. But in terms of the impact on Tower Hamlets, we've already talked about a financial impact. I think that will be the biggest short-term impact, especially on heating and energy. If this goes into next winter, it's going to be really bad in terms of people's energy and heating bills. We need to start preparing people for that. Food prices will go up. And if you think about it, when I lived in West London, there were lots of Poles who lived there, who came to Britain kind of in 1945 or earlier, and then couldn't go back because Poland was a communist state. They set up in Hammersmith this Polish cultural center. So if actually Ukraine does fall and does get occupied, we will see another wave of Ukrainian refugees that will flow across Europe and into Britain as well. We have we already have quite a few Ukrainians and Russians already living here. And then, and the other thing we need to be doing as well is that, if we want to defeat people like Putin, we need to make actually UK a good place for Russians who don't like Putin to come here. It's actually, we need to be welcoming the young, Russians who don't want to live in a Putin state, that they can, many of them probably will go to places like Dubai, but yes, some of them will want to come to London, and we should be encouraging that, because that will weaken Russia and Putin in the long run, which is not what we don't want to weaken countries. We should, all countries should be growing, and we should be trading with them and all the rest of it. But as long as Putin controls Russia, the reality is that we're going to have to keep Russia, as weak as we possibly can do, because that was the logic of the Cold War.
I think the other thing people don't realize how terrible a war situation is and how complex it is. So on the way back from the airport, I was picked up by a Bulgarian taxi driver, and he told me that his wife's from Ukraine. This is how complex it is. He grew up in Russia. His father was an engineering student, so they encouraged students. So near St. Petersburg, his father studied there, and they lived in a town nearby. And then his wife's got relatives in Russia and in Ukraine. The relatives in Russia have been conscripted into the Russian army, and then the relatives in Ukraine have been conscripted into the Ukrainian army. So you got relatives fighting relatives. You got uncles fighting nephews, cousins fighting cousins. That's how, and I don't think that's people here pick it up. They're willing to take side. They don't realize how terrible a wartime situation is. If someone cut off your gas and electricity for 48 hours, you wouldn't be in a cheery mood, trust me. So imagine if you're weeks, 2 weeks without gas and electricity, how people feel like that. And I think that kind of humanity is lost in this kind of empathy or sympathy is lost in these kind of Twitter exchanges or WhatsApp exchanges, and people, I don't think, just realize how terrible it is, and what a massive impact, what a massive thing it is to invade another country. It hasn't happened in Europe for quite a while.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have it to hand, but I think her name is Anna Politkovskaya. I know I mispronounced that, but she was a Russian. She wrote about the war in Chechnya and about the Battle of Grozny in 1994, and it was very similar because they all kind of knew each other and had relationships on both sides, and that was a terrible battle. And there was then the subsequent invasions as well. That's one of the reasons why Chechnya remains this really sort of messed up country, is because of what happened in 1994. So yes, I mean, that is the worst case, that if this doesn't get resolved in the next couple of weeks. I mean, the war in Finland in 1939, when the Soviets invaded Finland, I mean, that took 4 or 5 months before that got, and it was very similar to this war in terms of, like, Russians making lots of mistakes, but then they used lots of heavy artillery, and in the end, the Finns had to surrender, but at least they stayed as an independent state. But that doesn't seem to be what Putin is intending, but we'll see.
So you're raising a motion in full council, Andrew, on this issue. It seems like it's not going to get heard, but I don't know what my colleagues, whether they'll change the order or business or suspend standing orders to allow it to hear. It'd be. I think it is important for people to know the position of the council on this issue. So we're coming to the end of the show. Andrew, anything to look out for next week apart from the full council meeting?
Just the full council meeting. So there's a motion about the Whitechapel market, which will be interesting. Perhaps we can talk about next week. There'll be a Labour motion talking about their record of success, and there'll be a counter motion from me pointing out perhaps where they've been not as successful as they would like to claim that they were, which maybe again we could talk about next week. So
cool. Well, thank you everyone for watching the Weekly Politics Show. I'm Councillor Premier with co-host Councillor Andrew Wood. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Oof.